A break on global political crisis unfolding. A president of the United States Donald Trump stepped in announcem om terrorism Canada, annonsa on mine hester cars Florin and Sacho Korosti. As reporters gather in Washington, Donald Trump explains the terms of the proposal. The plan would allow the United States to gain influence over Canadian monetary policy, energy expectations ascribe window far more than a normal trade agreement. Political observers across the world react with disbelief as the ultimatum delivered to Canada appears to challenge the traditional relationship between two long-standing democratic allies, the United States and Canada.
While the press conference in Washington continues, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney immediately begins contacting allied governments, opening urgent diplomatic discussions with leaders across Europe and Asia.
Within minutes of the ultimatum announcement, a formal diplomatic communication from the Canadian government is transmitted to embassies across the world, including partners in the G7 and representatives of the United Nations. Canada does not accept ultimatums from foreign governments. We will defend our sovereignty and our economic independence. Rather than negotiating individual demands inside the framework presented by Donald Trump, the Canadian government rejects the entire premise of the proposal and argues that no democratic nation can surrender economic sovereignty to another country. Global financial markets are reacting rapidly as investors try to understand the escalating conflict between the US and Canada. This conflict could reshape international trade and political alliances in ways we are only beginning to grasp. Canada activates emergency provisions within its comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the European Union, accelerating access for Canadian goods and resources to European markets. Officials in Europe confirm that the request from Canada has been accepted and that expanded economic cooperation between Canada and the European Union will move forward immediately. Energy companies and investors have responded instantly as Canadian energy stocks surge following the announcement. This signals growing confidence that Canada will find alternative markets for its resources. The Canadian government then reveals a sovereign economic security protocol, a national strategy designed to strengthen domestic infrastructure and reduce dependence on foreign economic control. The Sovereign Economic Security Protocol, introduced by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, includes emergency authorization for general resources to reach global markets without relying on American refining systems. Government officials in Ottawa explain that these projects include new Pacific export terminals designed to connect Canadian oil and natural gas directly with customers in Asia and Europe. The strategy also includes the construction of advanced processing facilities in Northern Ontario, where critical minerals such as lithium and rare earth elements will be refined inside Canada rather than exported as raw materials. Economic analysts explain that refining resources domestically could allow Canada to capture far greater economic value from its natural resources while reducing dependence on foreign processing industries. Global mining companies that operate in both the United States and Canada begin reviewing their investment strategies as possibility of a major shift in North American supply chains becomes more likely. Financial markets respond quickly as investors evaluate how Canada's new strategy could redirect capital toward domestic infrastructure and manufacturing projects. In another unexpected announcement, Mark Carney formally requests an emergency meeting of the G7 nations to discuss the growing use of economic pressure between allied countries. Today, I propose a new international framework to protect sovereign democratic nations from economic coercion by larger powers within global alliances. This framework will ensure fair and resilient international cooperation. Diplomatic channels across Europe and Asia immediately begin discussing the proposal as governments consider how such a framework could reshape the rules governing international economic relations. Within hours, several major allies, including France, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom, gave support for holding an emergency G7 session to address the crisis. The rapid international reaction signals growing concern that the dispute between the United States and Canada could transform the balance of economic influence within the Western alliance. Political analysts explain that the Canadian response represents a calculated diplomatic strategy focused on coalition building rather than direct confrontation. Instead of responding with retaliation alone, and Canada begins strengthening partnerships with democratic economies across Europe and the Pacific region. Canadian officials explain that expanding economic partnerships with Europe and the Pacific region, part of a long-term diversification strategy designed to reduce dependence on any single market. Trade experts note that Canada's recent agreements with partners in Europe, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Australia are already opening alternative markets for Canadian energy, minerals, and technology exports. The diversification strategy appears to have been designed for exactly this moment when economic pressure from a larger partner might threaten Canada's independent policy decisions. Trump's ultimatum is here. We must assess its impact on our allies immediately.
It risks decades of trust. Europe and Asia will push back hard.
Exactly. It could fracture NATO and trade deals. We need a counter strategy.
Agreed. Let's prepare our recommendations.
Some officials argue that stronger economic pressure should be used to force negotiations, while others warn that escalating the dispute could push allied nations closer together against the United States. Political commentators are calling this a rare moment when the traditional power dynamics of international being alliances
Indeed, we're seeing countries assert their interests in ways that
are fracturing, and across financial markets, investors continue analyzing how a prolonged conflict between the United States and Canada could disrupt global supply chains. Automotive manufacturers express growing concern because many production lines across the American Midwest lie heavily on components shipped daily across the US-Canada border. Energy companies also warn that disruptions in Canadian oil supply could create shortages for American refineries designed specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. Agriculture exporters are now calculating potential losses if retaliatory tariffs from Canada reduce access to one of the most valuable foreign markets for American farmers. Economic experts explain that the United States and Canada have built one of the most deeply integrated trading relationships in modern economic history. For decades, goods, energy resources, and industrial components have moved freely across the border, supporting millions of jobs on both sides. Because of this deep integration, the sudden political conflict between the two nations has captured the attention of governments around the world. Security analysts also emphasize that the two countries cooperate closely through continental defense partnerships, including NORAD, which coordinates aerospace defense across North America. The combination of economic integration, military cooperation, and decades of diplomatic partnership makes the current dispute particularly significant for global stability. Diplomatic observers explain that the response from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney reflects a carefully prepared strategy focused on building international coalitions instead of reacting emotionally to political pressure. Officials in Ottawa emphasize that protecting national sovereignty remains the central principle guiding Canada's response to the ultimatum announced earlier by Donald Trump. European governments begin reviewing the implications of the crisis as leaders consider how economic pressure between allies could affect the stability of the Western alliance. Financial analysts observe that investors are closely watching whether the dispute will escalate into broader economic confrontation between North America's two largest trading partners. Reports from international media indicate that several democratic nations are quietly discussing deeper cooperation with Canada in energy technology and critical mineral supply chains. Experts explain that Canada possesses some of the world's most valuable reserves of lithium, uranium, potash, and rare earth minerals that are essential for modern technology industries. Developing domestic refining capacity for these resources could transform Canada into one of the most important suppliers for advanced manufacturing sectors across Europe and Asia. At the same time, political tensions in Washington continue rising as lawmakers debate how the confrontation with Canada could affect the American economy. Several of my colleagues and I from border states are deeply concerned that prolonged economic conflict could severely damage key industries that rely on smooth cross-border trade. Business organizations representing manufacturers, farmers, and energy producers are urging government officials to find a diplomatic solution to the growing dispute. We must avoid tariffs and preserve these vital economic relationships. Policy analysts explain that the integrated supply chains linking the United States and Canada were built over decades of cooperation and cannot be easily replaced. Because of this deep economic integration, even small disruptions in trade policies can create large ripple effects throughout North American industries. Meanwhile, the international community continues watching closely as preparations begin for a possible emergency meeting between the world's leading democratic economies. Diplomatic sources confirm that discussions within the G7 are moving quickly as leaders attempt to address the growing tensions between two key members of the alliance. Observers note that the outcome of these discussions could influence the future structure of economic cooperation among Western democracies. As the situation develops, international observers are focusing on the larger geopolitical implications of the dispute between the United States and Canada, two nations that have traditionally represented one of the strongest alliances in modern global politics. The peaceful border shared by the United States and Canada has symbolized stability, cooperation, and democratic partnership for more than a century. Because of this long history, the sudden appearance of an ultimatum demanding major economic concessions has surprised diplomats and analysts across the world. In Ottawa, government officials continue emphasizing that Canada's response is not about confrontation, but about protecting the principle that sovereign nations must control their own economic decisions.
Our democratic alliances function best when cooperation is built on mutual respect rather than pressure or coercion.
Across Europe, several political leaders have publicly expressed support for the idea that democratic countries should work together to prevent economic intimidation within international partnerships. The crisis could accelerate new global trade networks, reducing reliance on any single dominant market.
Indeed, we're seeing a shift towards regional partnerships that distribute risk more evenly.
This could lead to a more resilient. Investors continue monitoring developments closely as financial markets respond to each new diplomatic signal emerging from Washington, Ottawa, and European capitals. Energy experts explain that Canada's vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and critical minerals give the country significant strategic influence in the global energy transition. Developing new export routes through Pacific infrastructure could allow Canadian resources to reach fast-growing markets across Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. Technology companies are also paying close attention because access to reliable supplies of lithium and rare earth elements is essential for manufacturing batteries, electronics, and renewable energy systems. Analysts suggest that the decisions made during this crisis could reshape supply chains for many high-technology industries over the next decade. Meanwhile, political debate inside the United States continues intensifying as lawmakers consider how escalating tensions might affect domestic economic stability. Business leaders and economic organizations urge policymakers to carefully evaluate the long-term consequences of disrupting one of the most integrated trading relationships in the world. As preparations move forward for a possible emergency meeting among global leaders, the world continues watching closely to see whether diplomacy or confrontation will shape the next chapter of this unfolding international crisis.